Hey folks, I just thought I'd was having some thoughts, which I know is always really alarming. As I think I've mentioned here before, one of the books I've actually just finished is called The Praetorian Discordia, and I'll put a little bit more information out on it, with the synopsis and things like that. When I'm ready to release the audio version of that, probably about a week or two. But it's a science fiction story set in a post-apocalyptic Earth after humans have invented space travel and things like that. Um, and what I was thinking actually while I was recording the audio chapters of this was um, about technology and how there's one technology which I think is probably vital, I would say, to humanity leaving our gravity well and going to the stars, but one that doesn't seem to be getting a lot of research attention, at least from what I can tell currently, um, and surprisingly little attention in science fiction, although gets a lot of it. And what technology is this? Now you might think it's like, oh, you got to have fusion, which of course would help, or figure out some way to go faster than light, all those things, or control gravity. But I don't think it's any of those. I think it's actually cryogenics, a way to put a human into suspended animation and then wake them back up. Now, I don't mean to say that this doesn't get any play in science fiction because it does. It actually, there's a lot of movies out there that include this. Gosh, just off the top of my head, the first time I think I remember seeing it was in an early original Star Trek episode where they first meet Khan. I think the Kirk and the Enterprise find a ship, a derelict spaceship called the Botany Bay, and Khan and his minions are all in there in cryo sleep. And then they wake him up, and Khan, being an asshole, tries to take over the ship. But anyway, it's an interesting episode if you want to see that. But it's kind of continuously a theme in science fiction. 2001 Space Odyssey, it's in there. Pandorum, which if you haven't seen is an excellent kind of space horror movie, features cryogenic suspension in it. Alien, all the whole Aliens franchise, it includes it in there. Um, Gosh, I mean, it pops up regularly. I mean, hell, even Passengers, there was that movie. It's kind of a rom-com Titanic and space movie, but yeah, cryogenic suspension plays a role in that as well. Um, so it's weird to me first that there doesn't seem well. Let me step back and say why I think it's so important, because there's a lot of barriers to going. Let's say we want to go to Mars, which seems to be the next step that our governments are trying to take. There's a lot of problems, of course, with going to Mars. The first and most obvious of which is the amount of supplies that you're going to need to support the crew and then whatever colony you have once you get there. So it doesn't make much sense to me to pack in all this air and water and food and all that to support humans living, running around and doing all that stuff, when you could essentially put them to sleep where they wouldn't be using all this oxygen and supplies, and save that cargo capacity for something else, like supplies that you would need when you were actually on Mars or something like that. And it doesn't actually make much sense to have humans running around in the ship while you're on your way there, because really, I mean, machines can run most of the stuff. You really only want to wake up a human when there's going to be some sort of emergency that whatever your computers on board can't handle. So to save on the cargo space, if nothing else, um, why not put the humans to sleep? Have them sleep for an hour or for the couple years or year, whatever it would take to get to Mars. It seems like a no-brainer, logical thing to me, but it's actually even more useful. So first off, humans are social beings, but we tend to be kind of crabby about it. So rather than having to deal with all these social issues or potential social and psychological issues. I mean, you're going to get those on Mars anyway, but if you minimize the amount of time that people spend around each other, you're probably going to be able to minimize these issues as well. But another one of the hazards in deep space travel is radiation. Um, so, there's all this talk about, okay, well, we need to add shielding to these ships, which, makes sense because you don't want people to get irradiated and die. But again, that adds weight to the ship, which means you're going to have more propellant, et cetera, et cetera. So why, instead of trying to shield the whole ship, why don't you just shield the cryopods? They're smaller, right? Probably take up, less, less shielding, less weight. So it's another thing that you can get. And, and then the last thing, you talk about rescue. It's going to be really hard to rescue people. Oh, and actually, that brings up another movie which is awesome, which deals with cryogenics, which is called Event Horizon, which is a horror movie. Dear God, that thing is genuinely terrifying. If you haven't seen Event Horizon, that's a good one. But rescue plays a part in that because they're actually sent out to rescue the crew of a ship, but they actually have to go into cryo themselves and hope that whoever's left over there got into their cryo tube as well. Anyway, I digress. But it's going to be a lot easier to rescue somebody if you don't have to worry about them running out of air, in a week. So it also helps from a rescue standpoint. So, and weirdly, cryogenics doesn't play as big of a role as I would think in science fiction. And I think, for example, in Star Trek Beyond that episode I mentioned earlier, or Star Wars, definitely not. But these big blockbusters, they don't include cryogenics at all. And of course, the reason for that is very simple. People like to see social interactions. And if you want to see social actions in space, you can't have everybody just sitting there snoring the whole time. But, that's understandable. But you can still have those, in my opinion, you can still have those social interactions once they get there. You don't necessarily need to have everybody traveling somewhere for months or years and yammering and fighting with each other the entire time. Because honestly, I think they'd be batshit crazy by the time they got to wherever they were going. So I understand why they do it, but what's a little less, what I understand less, and I love The Expanse. I want to be 100% honest about this. I think The Expanse is awesome. It's probably the best science fiction show that I've ever seen. It's definitely my top favorite. But I do wonder why they didn't include cryogenics in that storyline. Because honestly, with all that talk about gravity and acceleration, things like that, that realism that they put in there as much as they could and still make it entertaining, it doesn't make any sense to have the crew awake and, and breathing and crapping everywhere and all that stuff if it's going to take you a month or so to get to Jupiter, for example. So anyway, I think cryogenics, honestly, it plays a big role in the stories that I'm writing, the Regnum Humanitas universe. And so if you're writing science fiction, give it a shot. See how that changes your story. If you make that one of the central technologies for space flight, which I think realistically it is. It is probably one of the main ones, which again makes it weird that we're not spending money to research it, at least that I'm familiar with. Oh, and that reminds me of one more thing why you'd want to use cryogenics. Acceleration, gravity. I think most of us know, and The Expanse again does an excellent job of this. If you accelerate up to 2G or 3G or whatever, you run the real risk of turning your crew into paste on the bulkheads. Unless they're strapped in. I mean, even if they're strapped in at some point, you're going to kill your crew. So The Expanse does an excellent job of this, and they include something, drugs and things like that to increase humans' resistance to that. But I think if you've got everybody potted up, why not fill pod with gel or some sort of something to cushion the acceleration. Then if everybody's, you can still use the drugs and pump the drugs in to help, but the crew's going to be sedated, so theoretically they won't be in as much pain, one would hope, if you're going to have to pull a high G burn. They might be a little more resistant to it. But anyway, that's just something that came to mind while I was recording the Praetorian Discordia, which, like I said, will be out in a week or two. So if you're writing science fiction or thinking about science fiction or putting together a podcast, I would urge you to think about cryogenics and think about including that in your story and think about how that changes your story and how it changes how humans are interacting with space, for example. You don't have to, obviously, but I think if you're trying for any sort of realism, it would be well worth your while. Okay. And I've got a couple other technologies I was going to talk about, but I'll do that in the next episode. So y'all have a good day.